On the 12th of July 1958, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Colin Hanton and John Lowe visited a recording studio in Liverpool to cut their first record as the Quarrymen. The man who cut the disc was Percy Phillips, who sadly died back in 1984, so can't share his memories with us. Joining us instead is his grandson Peter Phillips, who remembers visiting the studio as a boy. I'm Laura Davis.
And I'm Ellen Kirwin, and this is Beatles City. The recording studio was just in a room in his house, is that right?
Yeah, so it was an ordinary house in Kensington in the north of Liverpool, which actually is quite close to where Cilla Black grew up. And Percy Phillips decided to put a record shop in his front room, and then the recording studio was simply the room behind that.
And why did the Quarrymen decide to record there?
So this was Liverpool's first ever recording studio, and everybody who wanted to make a record, and there were lots of young people wanting to do that at the time, would go there and would cut it there. So he had all sorts of people there, including Ken Dodd, the comedian, who actually went there to record one of his as well.
If you enjoy the podcast and want to help us grow and reach more Beatles fans, make sure you rate, review and subscribe to the Beatles City podcast.
Hi, Peter.
Hello, Laura.
So can you tell me, your grandfather would talk about this a lot, or was this just sort of a casual thing for him?
You mean the Beatles connection?
The Beatles connection, yeah.
Well, no, it wasn't talked about a lot because it was just his job, and the studio was in the family home. It was just part of life in those days, and there was a record shop in the front room of the house downstairs.
Wow.
And then the recording studio was in the middle living room. And then the place where we'd sit and eat, the kitchen/dining room, was at the back of the house. When he got older, Grandma used to talk about the cavern. When the cavern got demolished, people were paying £1 apparently for bricks from the walls. She wanted to know why Percy didn't receive some remuneration because he was the first man to record the Beatles, but that was just sort of family chat, and that'd be like later in the 70s, you know, after they'd demolished the cavern.
I thought you were going to say she was going to knock down their house and sell the bricks.
Well, there's a suggestion. We could still do that. So we didn't really discuss it in any... I don't know how old you are and if you remember, but during the 1980s, the Beatles weren't really that celebrated, shall we say, in Liverpool.
Yeah. Because
punk happened, didn't it, in the late 70s, and then throughout the 80s, all this new romantic stuff and drum machines and, you know, synthesizers came to the fore, and these big groups that were like analog, if you like, you know, they used bass, drums and guitar and keyboards, and in the case of the Beatles, various other instruments and sound studio techniques. And it was sort of out of fashion in the 80s. Towards the end of the 80s, people started appreciating them a bit more, I think, and then throughout the 90s, when Anthology was released, in fact, in 1995,
yeah, the
Beatles just had this huge renaissance, didn't they? And a lot of the bands around at the time started saying that, you know, well, listen to that music, man, it's just totally perfect. The production, the playing, the songwriting, hundreds of songs, one after the other, all getting to number one, you know, the first few. And so ever since the 90s, I think, the Beatles have been seen as, you know, the best band the world's ever seen, sort of thing, in that.
Yeah, it's quite incredible.
Genre.
But you do remember him telling you about that, about their visit?
Yeah, we had many a chat about it, because I'm a musician myself. When I was playing in bands, when I was about 12 or 13 in Liverpool, and 14, I'd go to him to ask advice about, you know, PA systems, or, well, I'm a drummer myself, but I remember on one occasion, Laura, that our guitarist, we'd been listening to Led Zeppelin, and then we did one of their songs as a cover. He was trying to get this distorted sound on his guitar. I think he had a Gibson SG. So I went to see Grandpa with me dad actually one day, and said, you know, my guitarist, he wants to get this distorted sound on his guitar. Me dad and Grandpa burst out laughing, because they'd spent years trying to get rid of distortion and every hum and buzz and crackle. You know, to them, you wanted a pure, clean sound, out of your electronics. You didn't want buzzes and clicks or distortion, which they saw as a bad thing.
Yeah.
So when the laughter had died down, they went into the workshop, which was the studio then, but the studio had closed by then, but still had all the equipment in it, and it was like a little workshop. He got this metal box, and they knocked up a distortion pedal with a button in it and a jack plug in and out, and with a button on the front to press, and said, "Here, try that," which our guitarist did, and he had it for years, actually.
Wow.
Just an on-off distortion pedal.
So how long was the studio open for?
He opened it in 1955, and it closed at the end of 1969, so basically 15 years.
And that wasn't his background, was it? So what made him decide to open a studio?
Well, it's an amazing story, Laura, because it reflects the times, I think, of Liverpool in those days, because Grandpa was born in 1895, and in 1955 he was 60 years old.
Yeah.
And he had spent the previous 30 years, from 1925 up to 55, in that same house at number 38 Kensington, which you can see today is still there. It's got a blue plaque on it now that was put there in 2005. Mm-hmm. But he'd spent 30 years as a battery charging was his job. One of his first jobs he had as a young man after he came back from the First World War, where he was injured in France. In 1921, he took over the Raleigh bicycle dealership in Brunswick Road in Kensington, in the Kensington area. And he was selling bicycles, which at the time, 1921, were technology themselves, gears and sprockets. Bicycles were technology. They were seen as a new, exciting form of transport.
Yeah.
So he was selling bicycles to the people of Liverpool. And then a couple of years later, he started selling motorbikes. And so when he got into motorbikes, repairing motorbikes as well, all self-taught, of course, as a lot of these pioneers in those days were self-taught, whether it was Marconi or John Logie Baird and Grandpa, Percy Phillips, he became very interested in batteries, because there were batteries on motorbikes, of course, to make them run and to start them and for the electrics on them. And so he became fascinated by batteries and electricity, because there was no electricity in those days. When he was born, Laura, right, 1895, as I said, there was no telephone, there was no electricity, there was no aeroplanes, there was no cars, there was no anything really that we think of today as our basic technology. Photography had been discovered some years before, but most people had never seen a photograph or had a photograph taken. And there was certainly, the Wright brothers hadn't flown yet. Powered flight was still years away.
It's incredible, isn't it? We tend to think that technology is moving very quickly at the moment, but in his lifetime, everything had changed.
Yeah, it's incredible. That story is, the whole, Liverpool has got so many stories, hasn't it? What a city, what a place, what a history.
Yeah.
The stories that exist, the history of Liverpool, many of them have been told, of course, many of them haven't. And one of the biggest stories, if not the biggest story from Liverpool, is the Beatles. And but this is another story about Liverpool, from Liverpool, the Percy Phillips story, which hasn't really been told, or hadn't until we had this event during Beatle Week recently. So during the first few years of Grandpa's life, in the first 50 years, should we say, of the 20th century, all these things appeared in people's lives. All these pioneers, these guys were inventing, discovering, adapting, developing this technology, and electricity was one of them. No one in Liverpool had electricity in the 20s, 30s, 40s. It was only after the Second World War when, Liverpool was very badly devastated by bombing in the war. And there's photos you can see which are just totally shocking of Church Street, just totally flattened, just rubble. And of course, when John, Paul and George were kids, they were born around the 40s, John in 40, Paul I think in 42 or 3, and George 43. if they used to come into the city with their families at the weekend, or it was just a load of rubble. The place was totally trashed. Lewis's there, opposite the Adelphi on the corner, was just a burnt out husk. Like the bombed out churches now.
Yeah.
And Church Street and down by the Victoria Monument was just literally piles of rubble. So as they rebuilt Liverpool there during the 50s, it became electrified. And so Grandpa's battery charging service, because electrical things people had in those days were basically just radios. There was no other electrical stuff in the 50s and before. So they'd come and charge their batteries up to run their radios off. So once people had electricity in the house, it was no longer necessary. But what happened was, Grandpa had developed this interest in technology, and inspired by these pioneers who were inventing and discovering things. So he opened this battery charging service and became the bloke in Liverpool to go to for your batteries.
Wow.
So during the war, he was employed by Burton Wood Air Base. Anyone who goes on the motorway from the rocket there will have gone past Burton Wood services. But at that exact spot, there was a huge American air base during the Second World War, Burton Wood Air Base. Grandpa used to provide them with batteries and charge their batteries up. And so he was a regular visitor to the air base. He'd go at night as well on his motorbike to the Skyline Club, which was on the base, where he saw like Glenn Miller, and Harry James, which were some of his favourite music.
Oh, wow.
And he'd, do the battery thing. Also at that time, a lot of guys were coming, forces personnel from America, and they'd bring boxes of records, singles, like Sun records, Chess records and others.
Yeah.
Dance band music, blues music, from the South.
Yeah.
And Grandpa started getting these boxes of records from them. And so he ended up, when the battery business had gone off, he was thinking, what can I do now with the shop? So he turned it into a record shop. And it became the place to go in Liverpool to get your American music, your blues and your early R&B. And, of course, like dance band music and country music, which was Grandpa's favourite. Hank Williams was his favourite singer,
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was how that sort of started, the music side of it. He opened a record shop and that was in about 1954.
And that was in the front room of their house?
Downstairs front room of the house, yeah.
Incredible.
Which had been a shop for 30 years, when it was the battery shop, but it was now a record shop. So I've got loads of memories as a young kid being in that record shop. We used to sit on the counter, me and my sister, with our legs dangling off the counter, and listening to the records. People had come in and asked to have a record played before they bought it, and Grandpa or Grandma would play the record for them. There was a record player on the counter, we just loved that.
So you're making me feel very nostalgic for a time when I wasn't born.
Well, they were happy days, simple enjoyment of new things that were appearing, like records.
Yeah.
Discs, vinyl. And so then me and my sister, we'd dash out the record shop, dash into the studio and start bouncing up and down on the floor in there and miming using the microphones, and generally messing about. And then Grandpa would come and tell us to shift out of there.
So what was he like? He must have been quite a character to, at 60, decide that this was, that this was something he ought to be doing.
Yes,
and 60 then was a lot older than it is now.
Indeed. No, you're totally right there, Laura, yeah. And I wonder that myself, what inspired him. Grandma always said he had a brainwave, and that was how it was explained, that someone had come into the shop asking, could they cut a record? Because, they used to have these booths in those days, didn't they, where I think there was one in Nems, in Brian Epstein's family shop, record shop, where you could go into this little booth and cut like a 2-minute disc of you saying something or singing.
Yeah, I think they've got one now.
Come in and ask that, and then he had seen an advert in the newspaper. Because in those days, like the mid to late 50s, there were a lot of companies making tape recorders and disc cutting machines in Britain. The biggest one was MSS, Master Sound Systems. My dad, who was Percy's oldest son, he had started working for EMI, and he was working down doing a training course at Hayes in Middlesex for EMI, learning to become an electronics engineer. And Grandpa went to stay with him in 1955, June, July. And he bought this recording equipment, a recording studio, 3 pieces, an amplifier with a mixing desk, a reel-to-reel quarter-inch tape recorder, and a disc cutting lathe, which, it was the latest technology. It was really good stuff. He paid 400 quid for it.
Wow.
Which in 1955 was, about a year's wages for the average working person.
Yeah.
So it was really good stuff. It's your turn to talk while I have a swig of me mango juice.
I was wondering just what your granddad was like what his personality was like.
Well, he was very nice. He was mild-mannered, you would say. He was very professional. As a lot of people in those days, they took their work quite seriously in the sense that what they were producing had to be of really high quality. Mm-hmm. And so, he used to get up and wear a collar and tie and like a brown shop coat,
Yeah.
But it wasn't like dead smart in that sense. He was kind of relaxed looking,
Yeah.
He was very well liked and respected in the area. And regarding the family, he was a great fella. He was full of stories about his life. He used to take an interest in us all, even when we were little. Me and my sister and my brother, mm-hmm. and his own children. Yeah, he was a very nice chap. I never knew him to be angry or shouty, and he wasn't a big drinker or anything.
Yeah.
He'd go down into town once a week with his brother Uncle Reg, and they'd go in the Legs of Man or the Crown or wherever and have a pint.
So what did he have to say about the 12th of July in 1958?
Well, he didn't remember it specifically because such people as them were coming in every day.
Yeah.
And he thought it was all rather a terrible racket. The sound of these boys banging away on their instruments, washboards and things. He remembered when the Beatles came in 1960, John, Paul and George, mm-hmm. and they recorded a single-sided acetate of One After 909, and he remembered that visit. But the first visit by the Quarrymen, they were just another group of boys, and if you look at the logbook, you can see daily he was having these boys in, teenage boys. Because John was 17 at the time, Paul was, 15 or 16, and George 14 or 15, and
yeah,
he was 63 in 1958. So he seemed very old to them, and they seemed very young to him. Although they did have a drum kit, Colin Hanton, who you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
He had a drum kit which was quite unusual, so that would have been quite memorable.
Yeah.
And in fact, in spite of all the danger, when you listen to it, it's quite a country type sound. It's got because of course they were playing 3 acoustic guitars, although one of them George's I think was going through a little amplifier of Paul's, basically an acoustic session. As early rock and roll was all acoustic. One of Elvis's first stuff was on acoustic guitar.
We haven't actually said what was on the record yet. So it was Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day, and In Spite of All the Danger was the B-side.
That's correct. Yes, amazingly that, looking back now, clearly that Percy Phillips, he was a real pioneer, and that studio, my word, it's, it is the history of that studio. I'm glad it's being told now because John, Paul and George that was the first professional studio they ever visited. First time they gathered round a professional microphone. It was the first record they ever made, side 2, In Spite of All the Danger. It was the first time they recorded one of their own songs that they'd written. Also, that song, In Spite of All the Danger, is credited on the label to McCartney Harrison, and that's the only example in the whole of the Beatles canon that is credited to McCartney Harrison.
Wow. So
just from the Beatles story alone, that studio and Percy Phillips were, just that list of firsts that were, when you think what the Beatles went on to do and what each of the guys went on to do in their own careers, when it comes to using studios and technology and selling records, the biggest sales in history, the most famous band in history, that was where it started. That was their first one.
Yeah.
So, to Beatles fans, that's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
It is to me as well, and to our family, to realise that took place in our family home. But Beatles aside, if we can say such a thing,
Of course,
there were also many other firsts. It was the first recording studio in Liverpool, which I didn't realise until, years later. It was the place where Ken Dodd made his first ever record.
Okay.
It was where Billy Fiore made his first ever record. Percy recorded the first ever football pop song in 1963 with Everton FC when they'd won the league that year, and the team came in and sang this song that was specially written.
What was the song?
It was called Everton.
Okay.
And it was a jolly song with a piano, accordion and drums, and the team singing, and a soloist that they'd hired in, singing all about where the different fans came from, whether it was Woolton or Bootle or... It's a really good song. It's on the CD that I've released. Because this whole story, the reason that you and I are talking now, I suppose, is because, well, my grandpa died in 1984, and he left all his studio equipment, which he had kept, in good order, to me dad. And along with this box full of acetates, which he had collected during the 15 years the studio was open. Grandpa had put various acetates in a box, and then when it closed, we found this box, But then unexpectedly, my dad died in 1987, so I was left with all this stuff. So I was aware that, these books that I'd read, that say like Hunter Davis had written a book about the Beatles in the 60s.
Yeah.
And or anything you read or heard about the Beatles, no one had ever heard of Percy Phillips, or most people had never heard of the Quarrymen. And they certainly didn't know that the Beatles had made their first record in this little recording studio, Liverpool's first recording studio. So when I was left with all this stuff, I suddenly thought, maybe I should endeavour to get Grandpa recognised for what he was, Liverpool's first recording studio owner and the first producer ever to work with John, Paul and George.
Yeah.
Amongst all these other firsts, he did the first rendition of Musique Concrète, which was this mad music made up of, I suppose what you could call them samples, but in those days bits of tape cut up and stuck back together, noises made by banging found objects and playing instruments in funny ways. My dad and Grandpa demonstrated the first example of Musique Concrète in 1956 at the Philharmonic Hall. And so there's just this huge list of firsts. So I thought to myself, well, no one's ever heard of him. I think I should try, really, to get him his just desserts. So the way I started doing that is by putting the studio equipment, which was all there complete, in a Sotheby's auction in London, which I did. So photographs of the studio appeared in the catalogue, and a brief story about the studio. That was in 1990. And so that was the first step, really, of getting his name known, having it officially mentioned in this auction house catalogue.
Yeah.
The studio was actually bought by a chap called Tetsuo Hamada, who was the president of the Japanese Beatles fan club.
Oh, wow.
The Beatles Cine Club, as it was known. And he took it off to Japan that year, 1990. And so after that, coincidentally, well, the money that we got for that, we gave to Grandma so that she could, at last say, oh, well, we've got a couple of bob for it anyway. And she then, she lived to be 97, actually, Laura. She died in 2007.
Ah.
And that money helped her to, have a few holidays in Llandudno and what have you, and things she liked to do.
Oh, that's
so
so
that
nice.
was very good. She was a wonderful lady, and we all miss her.
Oh, I bet. There's 70 tracks, isn't it, that your grandfather recorded onto a vinyl record and CD, is that right?
Aye, that's exactly right, yeah.
So people can hear it for themselves then?
Yes. Just the other day I put the CDs on. There's 4 CDs in the box set. So it's a few hours of listening. Mm-hmm. But I put it on the other day and just listened to all 4 one after the other here in me flat through the hi-fi. And it's like a time machine, because it's not all music. There's lots of spoken word stuff. you just sit there, and it's like they're like audio snapshots, if you like. You sit there and shut your eyes, and you can. All these recordings were all made in this one room in Liverpool over a 15-year period. And at that period, like 55 to 69, the world just changed, didn't it? Everything changed. For some reason, all these young people, girls and boys, as they reached their teenage years, they decided to create their own culture. You know, for hundreds of years previously, young boys and girls had just followed in their mum and dad's footsteps. You know, they'd worn the same clothes, gone and got the same jobs, and were much like mini-me's of their mums and dads. But in that period, the mid-50s, it all changed, and for some indefinable reason, the young people suddenly decided to create their own music, their own fashion, their own culture, which they did, you know, and it's now known as the swinging 60s, but it began in the 50s, you know, with people. I suppose we could blame Chuck Berry for it because, you know, his was one of the first records, Maybelline, that turned on the young Liverpudlians to rock and roll. Of course, we'd had Skiffle before that, but Lonnie Donegan.
Yeah.
And that sort of got a lot of young people into, you know, using cheap or homemade instruments to make music, it was kind of the punk of its day in a way.
Like your washboards and things.
Yeah, exactly.
T-chest
the
bass.
Old T-chest bass.
Yeah.
But it was only about a year that lasted before, you know, John Lennon and his cohorts, they heard Chuck Berry, you know, and Little Richard, and then they heard Elvis, and then, you know, Buddy Holly and whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, the world changed forever. And, you know, we should all be very proud and aware of the fact that, you know, Liverpool was the place where that started. It's an amazing story.
That's incredible, and it just seems like it was such an exciting time.
Yeah, just the first time, you know, those guys, some of them are still alive today. Well, obviously Paul is, McCartney, but when we had our launch event for the CD and vinyl at the Adelphi on the 26th of August, that's like 3.5 weeks ago now, at the Beatles convention.
Yeah.
A few of these guys were there, like Owen Clayton, who made his first record with the Derek Clayton Skiffle group in 1957, I think that was, at Grandpa's studio. And there were loads of guys there who made their first records. Mike Byrne was there, he made his first record. It was just, these guys were pioneers, you know, they were going out on a limb. No one had done that before, you know, thrown on an old leather jacket and gone and played a T-chest bass in a pub, you know, and it was a whole new thing.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's still going on today, isn't it? Youth culture. You know, there wasn't any youth culture before that. It was all mum and dad culture.
And what was it like playing the record for them at the convention?
Well, it's stunning. As I say, it's like a time machine, Laura, because these, you know, each of the tracks lasts, you know, maybe a minute and a half. Some of them last 4 minutes. There's a couple that last about 12 or 13 minutes. Mm-hmm. And they really do transport you back, because some of them are spoken word, where you've got family members recording a message to another family member that was going off emigrating to Canada. Gosh. Which a lot of people did in the 50s, to Canada or Australia.
What were they saying? What was the message?
Well, they're saying, you know, we're sorry to see you go and good luck in your new life in Canada, and you can hear them sniffling, you know.
So they'd take that with them, would they? Yeah, and
then they'd sing a song, you know. One of the songs they sing is "We'll Meet Again." Oh. And it's very moving. And then I've got another recording that these all appear on the collection. Another recording which was done at Christmas in 1955, where Grandma's mum and dad have come to Christmas dinner, and Percy's brought the recording machine up into the room, obviously after dinner. But you know, well, I don't know if you do remember, but in the 50s and 60s, if you stuck a microphone in front of someone, they'd go all uncomfortable. Yeah. And they'd kind of talk in a posh voice, or what they thought was a clearer, posher voice. Like people always used to have a telephone voice where, you know, you'd phone me and I'd say, "Hello, how are you?" and give you a phone number, you know, and a telephone voice was a normal thing for people to have. Yeah. So the first couple of years, things like that appear, you know, and there's also a Rose Queen ceremony that he was invited to record at the church.
Yeah.
The local church in Kensington. And,
so you've got it's a real social history then, and people wouldn't have been recorded in their sort of home environment. It would have always have been a more formal situation, unlike now where we're recording everything all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
So there just can't be many recordings like that
now without second thought, would they?
Yeah, incredible.
And thankfully, we don't care nowadays so much about, accents or where it used to be a very different society that we had to live in, as people with northern accents. We were seen socially below the people with southern accents, posh southern accents. But that's long behind us now, hopefully. So then in the 1957, you start hearing rock and roll recordings. Johnny Guitar made his first disc there, who later became the guitarist in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, of course, with Ringo. And he does like the Little Richard song, She's Got It. It takes 1.5 minutes, but it's just totally brilliant.
Wow. Acoustic
guitar, rock and roll. And then you get Billy Fiore comes in April of 1958, shortly followed by the Quarrymen. And then throughout the 60s, you just get all manner of different pop groups coming in and recording, and piano players, and he recorded church choirs, all manner of things up to the later 60s. There were other studios open in Liverpool, but he still remained popular, particularly with country music. There was a folk club in Liverpool called Sampson and Barlow, which a lot of people will remember.
Yeah.
People from there used to come a lot to make records. Willie Russell, the playwright, he made his first record there.
Ah, right, okay.
Because he used to play on the folk circuit when he was...
He did, yeah. That's incredible. So such a range.
Yeah, so it really is. It was wonderful to sit. You're really transported back in time, because the quality, obviously, some of the discs are a bit scratchy, but we have cleaned them up quite a bit. And, the scratchiness just adds to the atmosphere. And,
like you were saying with the pedal.
You don't play them much. They last a long time. They're fragile in the sense that if you drop one, acetate discs this is, if you drop one, it'll shatter,
Yeah.
But if you don't drop them, they last for years. Obviously, every recording on this collection is at least 50 years old, And the Quarrymen recording, as you said earlier, is 60 years old this year.
Yeah.
In fact, it's funny that Paul McCartney, he tweeted a picture, don't know if you saw it, the day after we did our launch event. Paul tweeted a picture of himself sitting with playing his Phillips acetate of the Quarrymen. Because he owns it now, of course. It's in his collection.
Yeah, he bought it back, didn't he?
That's right, yeah, from John Lowe. I've got a replica of it, which I showed at the exhibition. Because the exhibition, I'll tell you a bit about the exhibition that happened. It was a wonderful day, because as I suggested earlier in our chat, I had been trying for many years to get Grandpa recognised as the pioneer of Liverpool music that he was, music recording and social recording. What were you saying? Social history.
Yeah.
And so that was achieved really on Sunday the 26th, because first of all, we had a new plaque made, a new blue plaque to commemorate Percy Phillips and the existence of the studio. And we had that unveiled by my auntie Carol Higgins, Percy's daughter, and Julia Baird, who you'll know is John Lennon's sister.
Yeah.
They unveiled the plaque in the morning at our exhibition. And then we had a gold disc version of Ken Dodd's first disc made, and put it in a frame with a nice brass plaque and that. Then we presented that to Ken's widow, Lady Anne Dodd.
And what was it? What was the recording?
The recording was Ken singing "It Is No Secret."
Okay. Which
is one of his favourite religious songs, because he just had the most amazing singing voice. And I'm quite sure he would have become a professional singer had he not had the success as a ventriloquist and comedian, Yeah. And he had that sort of humorous appearance, which he played up to, didn't he, with his teeth and his hair?
Yeah, because he had gold discs and things, didn't he?
Yeah.
From way back.
Yeah, well, he was a singer. In fact, he was Grandpa's favourite singer. Grandpa used to love him singing. He recorded him many times. But the gold disc that we made for Lady Anne was of his first ever. That was March 1957. Yeah, and then Ken became successful and famous in Britain, as a ventriloquist and comedian. But then once, as you just indicated, once he'd become successful, he did actually record quite a few songs, two of which were very very popular in Britain. Happiness was a huge tune, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And in the 70s, I suppose that was. And then Tears was another huge hit for him.
Yeah.
So he always kept up the singing. And he used to go to church every week with Anne and, sing in church. Mm-hmm. He was quite a, religious, spiritual guy.
Yeah. Oh, that
and it was so sad, when he died earlier this year, it was a real... it was really sad time in Liverpool, wasn't it?
Oh,
People
yeah,
were very,
extremely
even though
sad.
he was old, and he had been unwell, it was still a terrible shock that he had gone.
Yeah, it's hard to
And we were
imagine him
hoping
not
that he
here.
had come to our event at the Adelphi, but obviously that couldn't happen.
Yeah.
So we were very, very, very pleased that Lady Anne agreed to come and receive this gold disc from us as a presentation. Mm-hmm. So that was wonderful. So the people that we had in that room throughout the day, Laura, it was amazing. We had another Beatles sister, Ruth, Paul's sister, Ruth, was there most of the day. Just all manner of journalists from around the world, and Beatles fans, who some of whom had heard of Percy Phillips because of the Quarrymen recording, but they didn't realise that he was actually had such a wide variety of things that he had achieved, during those 15 years.
Yeah.
Or also that he was like quite an old fellow when he opened the studio, and he had this whole other story to tell about when he had the battery service and, the history of Liverpool and the development of technology, through it wasn't that long ago. That was the point I was trying to make with the exhibition, really, was that all this technology that we've got now, it really is actually quite new, even cars and aeroplanes, and phones and things. It's all quite new, really. Our great-grandparents didn't have any of that stuff, and it was introduced to the world during, our grandparents' lives. And now it's just totally ubiquitous and normal, to have a phone or to book a flight or, watch the telly. But I remember him telling me a story about when he bought his first telly in 1952, and him and my dad, they went and picked it up. It was like a 9-inch black and white TV tube, in a wooden cabinet with doors on it. He said they put it in the corner of the room in the house at 38 Kensington there, and they opened these doors and switched it on, and they stood there laughing, saying to each other, "No, what is this? No one's going to sit in a room watching a little box like that with a fuzzy image on it. How is this ever going to become, successful or part of our lives?"
Little did they know.
Yeah, little did they know. That's the story of technology, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
The people who see it first don't necessarily see its value,
So just to go back, you mentioned that the Beatles returned to the studio.
Yeah, that's right. In 1960, they came with George's friend Arthur Kelly, and that's how we know the story, really, because Arthur remembered it well. In Mark Lewison, who's what they refer to as a Beatles author, he was at the convention interviewing various people like Pattie Boyd and Tony Bramwell, to hear their Beatles stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Mark Lewison wrote a book, a new book called Tune In, about the story, really detailed sort of minute-by-minute story of the Beatles. I think it came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago or something.
Yeah, that's right.
But I read it anyway, and this story is in there about how Arthur Kelly tells Mark Lewison that the three of them went back to Percy's studio in 1960 to record this single-sided acetate of One After 909, John's song, which he had written years before. But that acetate has never been found, so it's still out there somewhere if it still exists.
Ah, so it could crop up
and
one day.
Yes, it's a very interesting one, that, because that will have been a 7-inch acetate at 45 RPM, whereas the Quarrymen one is 10-inch at 78. Because from about 1959 or so, Grandpa started cutting on 7 inches at 45 RPM. So that was another thing that was changing, in society. People had been buying these big, heavy acetate 10-inch discs, and when vinyl was discovered, PVC, and it was much more flexible, and you could cut the grooves closer together so you could make a smaller disc, and the introduction of vinyl in America that happened. It really changed record manufacturing.
So what do you think your grandfather would make of all this attention now?
Well, yes, I wonder. He wasn't a great socialite, but I think because what was so wonderful to me and to the family members who attended at the Adelphi, we had this room, the Empire Room, for our exhibition. We had the whole room just for our exhibition, and we had a merchandise shop in there where we were selling the CD and the vinyl and some bits of merchandise that we'd made, pens and T-shirts, baseball caps and stuff, which were going very well. And we had the blue plaque there, beautifully mounted, and the presentation of the gold disc. And we had several display cabinets around the room, which was it's an octagonal room, Laura. It's a beautiful room, wood-panelled octagonal room. And we displayed it all with these display cabinets with lots of the acetates were on display from my archive. And other things were on display, such as the Quarrymen disc replica, Percy's birth certificate, some letters that, because Carol, Percy's daughter, was a friend of George's, in those days. And when they first went to Hamburg, George used to write to her regularly. And so there were a couple of letters I put on display that George wrote in the Star Club in Hamburg. It says at the top, Star Club Hamburg, and the date in 1962, December. And he had written to Carol about saying, the band's going well, and we're going to get signed up, and we've got a TV show to do in Scotland, and I'll see you at the Grafton next Friday, and things like this in these letters. So they were on display.
It's amazing.
The logbook from the studio was on display, along with lots of blow-up reproductions of the pages, because I've got the logbook from 1955 to 1958, which has got Ken Dodd, Billy Fiore, the Quarrymen, Swinging Blue Jeans, Black Diamonds, all sorts of people who visited the studio. Grandpa was quite a meticulous record keeper, actually.
That's
great. He liked to keep his business notes in order. So it was just really beautiful experience to have all these people, and lots of journalists, of course, and flashing cameras in this lovely room, put on an exhibition that was, I just felt it was full of respect for Grandpa, sort of giving him his due.
Yeah.
We weren't making any huge claims or anything. It was just a respectful exhibition dedicated to Percy Phillips and his studio, told in a thoughtful way by his own family. And so it was very satisfying to do that. After it's like 30 years I've been working on it in a way. But I'll tell you quickly how it came to be, because I put a website online about 10 years ago, I think it was in 2008, called phillipsacetates.com. I put that up, for people who might be interested as a sort of historical record. And if you go there to look at it now, that's what it is. It's a few pages of the basic story of the studio, and a few photos and that.
Yeah.
So that was there for 10 years. And then about 18 months ago, I got a phone call from this fella called Pete Goodall, and it turned out that he had made a recording at Grandpa's studio in 1963 with his group called Savva and the Democrats. Pete then went on to use that disc to get a contract as a musician, and then he's in his 70s now, but he spent the 60s and the 70s as one of Britain's top session players, guitarists,
Yeah.
He played on loads of hits throughout the 60s and 70s. He was one of the guys who was always in Abbey Road doing sessions. Mm-hmm. And he runs this record company now, Speakeasy Recordings. And the most amazing part was that the record that he made, which he hadn't seen or heard for 50 years, I actually had it in my archive. This 7-inch 45 acetate of his group Savva and the Democrats performing these 4 rock and roll songs, one of which was Shaking All Over, another one, Love Me Like a Hurricane. Really good renditions, really well recorded. They sound really bright and sparky. They sound great.
Brilliant.
So anyway, Pete came over to see me, and I gave him a digital copy of his recordings. And we ended up signing a contract, and it's him who's his record company that's put the project together. He and I have produced and directed it. I've written all the sleeve notes and the various bits of things that needed writing, and I've got this huge collection of photographs and stuff from the studio. We put it all together, and there it was, released for the first time, and it went really well actually. The CD and the vinyl, they're doing very well.
Peter, that's been so interesting. Thank you so much. That was just...
Oh, all right. I just wanted to say hello.
I
mean, all the best to your listeners.
Brilliant.
And good luck with your project there. It sounds great.
Thanks, Peter. Take care. Bye.
All right. All the best. Ta-da.